Okay, so we're now moving on to a summary or an overview of Act 1, and each of these videos will break down the act and really try to talk you through the plot, which at times can be quite complicated or convoluted. And at the end of each of these videos there'll also be two key quotes from each act that you should try to memorise and be aware of, and I'll try and discuss them with a little bit of detail and analysis. So Act 1, Scene 1, it starts on a heath and it starts with witches. And these witches are essentially planning and plotting how they're going to, ruin Macbeth's life, and they're basically planning and plotting meeting Macbeth. Macbeth and Banquo, who are two warriors, they have just won a battle on a battlefield in this kind of wilderness almost in Scotland, and then they stumble upon these witches and they meet these witches. These three witches then provide prophecies to the men. They start with Macbeth and they say, "You are Thane of Glamis," which is basically his title. "You will be Thane of Cawdor," which is a title somewhat above him. "And ultimately you'll become King of Scotland." This all at once excites and frightens Macbeth, because he thinks it's great that I could become king, but it's bad because how would that happen? How would I become king? Do I need to do something I would regret? Banquo also asks, is there anything kind of to be told to him? And he's told that he won't be king, but his sons will be kings thereafter. So they're told these prophecies, the witches disappear, and they kind of almost laugh to themselves like, this is silly, these are crazy ideas. I'm Thane of Glamis, but there is a Thane of Cawdor that lives. Now, almost at the same moment, they are then met by a messenger who tells Macbeth that the Thane of Cawdor has been executed because he was a traitor, and because Duncan was so impressed by your success in battle, Duncan has made you Thane of Cawdor. So, almost immediately one of the prophecies has came true, and this plants the seed of ambition within the mind of Macbeth, that he feels like if this has came true, maybe something else will. Now what he does is he sends all this in a letter to his wife, to Lady Macbeth. And when we get to Act 1, Scene 5, Lady Macbeth is reading this letter, and eventually she has her own soliloquy where she talks about her own ambitions, and she talks about the fear that she has that her husband won't be man enough to basically commit the act of regicide. So she kind of plots that she will try and persuade him and pour her own kind of persuasions in his ear to make sure he commits the act of regicide. The final scenes of the first act are basically Duncan being welcomed to the castle, to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's castle, and being welcomed with open arms and kind of a hearty and happy welcome to the castle, where all the while we know that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have planned and began their plotting to murder him in his sleep. So there's a duplicity in their actions. On the surface, they appear very welcoming and caring and loyal to Duncan, but underneath this, there's a sinister plotting that's going on where they're planning to kill Duncan in his sleep. Now, in terms of quotes, for each of these acts, I'm going to just narrow it down to two, just because that then over the course of the play means you'll have 10 in total. I would say that these are personal, again, they're subjective. There's tons of great quotes and great evidence that you could be selecting. But for me, one key quote is from Act 1, Scene 1, where we have the witches utter the quite famous phrase, "Foul is fair and fair is foul," or "fair is foul and foul is fair." It's a really good quote, it's so simple to remember for the exam, but it highlights a lot of key themes, the idea of nature being turned on its head. One of the key themes as well of like reality versus illusion. We're going to get to the point where there's a lot of hallucinations and visions that take place. So what seems fair is foul and what seems foul is fair. It's also important because the witches are speaking in a type of metre that's different from the rest of the characters in the play. They speak in something called trochaic tetrameter. And trochaic tetrameter is a type of metre that's very different from everyone else. They all speak, everyone else really, an iambic pentameter. Now this signifies them as being different from the natural order of things. Now what's important about that is it keeps them distant and separate, but it's also important to note that Macbeth actually repeats some of these phrases. He even says, "So foul and fair," or "So fair and foul a day I have not seen." So immediately from the opening of the play, we have a kind of subtle connection between the witches and Macbeth, which is foreshadowing his kind of deterioration towards the supernatural and black magic as things go on. The second quote I would say is most important is from Act 1, Scene 5, and it's Lady Macbeth when she remarks to herself that she believes her husband is too full of the milk of human kindness. And she basically thinks he's too loyal and too good a man to commit regicide, and she begins to plot and plan how she's going to persuade him to do what she wants, which is kill the king so that they can both become king and queen. Now, the reason that's really important is because it gives us an insight into her evil mentality, but it's also interesting because Act 1, Scene 5 is where we see Lady Macbeth as being super in control, very manipulative, commanding, and a sense of confidence about her. But then much later in the play, when we get to Act 5, Scene 1, which is simply just turning Act 1, Scene 5 on its head, so Act 1, Scene 5, then we get to Act 5, Scene 1, she has deteriorated dramatically, and she's actually at the point where she is her mental state is completely broken, and she is overwhelmed by the guilt that she has for having forced her husband into this. So those two quotes I would say are really important, and I would say, my personal opinion, those are the two I would suggest you try and memorise if you were picking just two. Hopefully that's helped. We'll move on to the second act in our next video. Thanks.